My name is Daniel, I'm 32 years old, and I've learned that family revenge stories don't begin with grand declarations, they begin with a simple dinner invitation that arrives with hidden strings attached. My mother called on a Thursday morning, her voice carrying that particular brightness that always preceded something uncomfortable. "We need to talk, all of us together," she said, and I felt my stomach drop. The words "we need to talk" from my parents had never once led to anything good. They were code for "we've decided something about your life and now we're going to tell you what it is." I should have declined right then, should have made up an excuse about work or prior commitments, but decades of conditioning made me say yes before my brain could catch up. But before we dive in, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this, stories about breaking free from toxic family patterns and reclaiming your power, are what this channel is all about. You're going to want to be here for what comes next, because what happened at that dinner table will change how you see family obligations forever. Trust me on this one. The dinner was set for Sunday at 6, and my mother insisted it had to be at their house, with my sister Claire and her husband Tom present as well. Witnesses, I realized later she was assembling witnesses, though at the time I just thought she wanted a family gathering. I'd been doing better lately, finally getting my photography business off the ground after years of working soul-crushing corporate jobs to please my parents. I had a small studio downtown, a growing client list, and for the first time in my adult life, I was waking up excited about my work instead of dreading it. I thought maybe this dinner was their way of finally acknowledging that, of maybe even celebrating my success. The emotional abuse in families often disguises itself as optimism in the victim's mind. We keep hoping this time will be different. I arrived with a bottle of wine and that familiar knot of anxiety in my chest that always appeared when I was about to spend extended time with my parents. My father opened the door wearing his serious conversation face, the one he used during my childhood when I'd brought home a B instead of an A, or when I'd chosen art classes over math camp. "Daniel," he said, gripping my shoulder in that way that was supposed to be affectionate but always felt like a warning. "Glad you could make it. Your mother's been cooking all day." Claire was already in the living room, perched on the edge of the couch with Tom beside her, both of them wearing expressions I couldn't quite read. Not quite pity, not quite sympathy, something in between that made my anxiety spike higher. What I expected was neutrality, maybe even peace. I'd been maintaining careful boundaries with my parents for the past year, keeping conversations surface level, avoiding topics that might trigger their usual criticisms about my life choices. My therapist had helped me develop scripts for deflecting their invasive questions, techniques for staying calm when they tried to provoke reactions. I thought maybe the boundaries were working, that maybe we'd finally found a sustainable way to coexist. The family drama that had defined most of my 20s seemed to have quieted down, or so I believed. Walking into that dining room, seeing the formal table setting and my mother's tight smile, I realized I'd been naive. The drama hadn't quieted, it had just been gathering strength. The witnesses were assembled with calculated precision. My sister Claire, 35 and golden child extraordinaire, sat across from me with her perfect husband and their perfect life serving as a constant rebuke to my choices. Tom worked in finance, made 6 figures, owned a house in the suburbs, everything my parents had wanted for me and I'd refused to pursue. They looked at me with something between concern and condescension, the way you might look at a relative who keeps making obviously poor decisions. My parents anchored each end of the table like judges presiding over a trial I hadn't known I was attending. The good china was out, the crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier, and classical music played softly in the background. Everything was designed to look civilized, loving even, which somehow made what was coming feel more sinister. Toxic family dynamics don't announce themselves with warning labels, they dress up as concern, as tradition, as family taking care of family. My mother brought out the first course, her famous French onion soup that she only made for special occasions, and I felt that old familiar dread settling into my bones. This wasn't just dinner. This was a performance, an intervention, a carefully orchestrated event designed to accomplish something I couldn't yet see. My father poured wine with steady hands and asked about my week in a tone that suggested he didn't really care about the answer, he was just following the social script before getting to the real agenda. I answered in bland generalities, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The emotional trigger that would define everything came during the soup course, so casual I almost missed it. My mother dabbed her lips with her napkin and said, "We're so glad you could come tonight, Daniel. We've been wanting to have this conversation for a while now." My father nodded in agreement, and Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Conversation about what?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. Some part of me had always known, had been bracing for this moment since the invitation was issued. My mother smiled, that smile, the one that looked warm from a distance but felt cold up close. "About your future, sweetheart. About the choices you've been making and how they're affecting all of us." I sat there with my spoon halfway to my mouth, the soup cooling, my heart rate accelerating. The public family dinner I'd walked into expecting some version of normalcy was already transforming into something else, something I recognized from a lifetime of similar moments. This was the setup. This was the emotional trigger that preceded every major confrontation in our family's history, the calm before the storm, the gentle preamble before the attack. And as I looked around the table at the faces of people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, I realized that I had two choices. I could play the role they expected, defend myself and eventually capitulate the way I always had, or I could do something different. Something that would change the family control dynamics forever. I just didn't know yet what that something would be. My father set down his wine glass with deliberate care, the sound of crystal meeting wood echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "Son, we need to talk about this photography thing you've been doing." The way he said photography thing made my decade of passion and year of professional work sound like a hobby I'd picked up last weekend. This was how controlling parents operated. They diminished what mattered to you with carefully chosen words, made your dreams sound foolish before you even had a chance to defend them. I felt my jaw tighten, but I stayed quiet, waiting to see where this was going. My mother jumped in quickly, her voice dripping with the false sweetness that always preceded her cruelest observations. "We're worried about you, honey. We've been very patient, letting you explore this creative phase, but it's time to be realistic. We're not saying you have to give up photography completely," my father continued, using that reasonable tone he always deployed when saying something completely unreasonable. "But you can't build a life on it. You're 32 years old, Daniel. You should be thinking about stability, about retirement accounts, about building equity." Claire nodded along like she'd heard this speech before, and she probably had, during whatever pre-dinner caucus my parents had held to get everyone on the same page. Tom looked vaguely uncomfortable but said nothing, already knowing his role in this family drama was to be the silent example of what success looked like. The guilt at dinner was being served alongside the soup, and I could feel it trying to take root in my chest the way it always had. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch gentle but her words poison. "Don't embarrass us by being stubborn about this, sweetheart. We're trying to help you. You're our son, and we love you, which is why we can't just sit back and watch you throw your life away." There it was, the equation that had controlled me for 3 decades. Their love was conditional on my compliance. Their support came with strings so numerous they might as well have been chains. And if I resisted, if I dared to have a different vision for my life than the one they'd scripted, I was embarrassing them. Not disappointing them, not worrying them, embarrassing them, as if my life choices were a reflection on their parenting rather than my own autonomy. "Be grateful that we care enough to have this conversation," my father added, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his own home. Most parents would just let their kids fail and then say, "I told you so." But we're not like that. We're proactive. We're trying to save you from yourself. The emotional abuse in families is particularly insidious when it wraps itself in the language of love and concern. How do you argue with people who insist they're only trying to help? How do you maintain boundaries with people who frame those boundaries as ingratitude? My therapist and I had role-played this exact scenario, but sitting here in real time, feeling the weight of their combined disappointment and Claire's silent judgment, all my prepared responses evaporated. Claire decided to contribute her perspective, because apparently this intervention required a united front. "Danny, I know you think we don't understand, but we do. I wanted to be a writer, remember? But I grew up. I got a real job. I built a stable life. And you know what? I'm happy. I can still write on weekends if I want to, but I don't have to worry about making rent or whether I'll have health insurance. She said it with such conviction, such practiced sincerity, that I almost believed she was happy. But I'd seen her at family gatherings for years, seen the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the way she drank just a little too much wine and laughed just a little too loud. She'd made her choice, sacrificed her dreams on the altar of parental approval, and now she needed me to make the same choice so she wouldn't have to face what she'd given up. We've actually been talking, my mother said, and the way she emphasized we made it clear this conversation had been happening for some time without my knowledge or input. And we have a solution that we think will work for everyone. She paused dramatically, waiting for me to ask what it was, but I refused to play along. The silence stretched uncomfortable and tense until she continued anyway. Your father has talked to Richard Chin. You remember Richard, Tom's old boss, and there's a position opening up in their marketing department. It's a great opportunity, Daniel. Real salary, benefits, room for advancement. They're willing to interview you as a favor to us. The silent power reversal I'd been planning in therapy felt very far away in that moment, buried under decades of conditioning that screamed at me to be grateful, to appreciate their efforts, to accept their version of what my life should look like. My father pulled out a folder, an actual folder, like he'd prepared a presentation for this intervention. Inside were printouts, job descriptions, salary ranges, benefits packages. Had done research. Had made calls. Had constructed an entire alternative life for me without bothering to ask if it was a life I wanted. This is what loving parents do, son. We don't just sit back and hope things work out. We take action. We create opportunities. He slid the folder across the table toward me like he was presenting evidence in a trial. All you have to do is show up to the interview. Richard already knows your background, knows you went to a good school. He's willing to overlook the gap in your resume, the time you spent on this photography experiment. The family control disguised as care was suffocating. Every word out of their mouths was designed to make me feel like a child who didn't know what was best for himself, like a project that had gone off track and needed correcting. Tom finally spoke up, his voice annoyingly reasonable. Look, man, I get it. Everyone has passions. But passion doesn't pay the bills. I wanted to be a musician in college, did you know that? But I made the smart choice, the adult choice. And now I can afford music lessons, a nice guitar, a home studio. You can have photography as a hobby, Daniel. You don't have to make it your whole life. The toxic family dynamics were on full display, and everyone at the table except me seemed to think this was normal, this was love, this was what families did for each other. The main course arrived, me mother's famous pot roast, the one she'd been making for Sunday dinners since I was a kid, and with it came a complete rewriting of my history. You know, Daniel's always been like this, my mother said to Tom, as if I weren't sitting right there, as if she were discussing a case study rather than her son. Even as a child, he had trouble focusing on what was important. Always with his head in the clouds, always drawing or taking pictures instead of studying for exams. My father nodded sagely, cutting into his meat with precise movements. We thought he'd outgrow it. We thought college would straighten him out, give him direction. But here we are, a decade later, and he's still chasing fantasies. The family humiliation was being served family style, passed around the table for everyone to sample. Claire jumped in with her own carefully selected memories, anecdotes I recognized but filtered through a lens that made me seem foolish, immature, perpetually lost. Remember when he dropped out of that finance internship Dad set up for him? Junior year of college. It was an incredible opportunity, connections that most people would kill for, and he just walked away because he didn't feel passionate about it. She used air quotes around the word passionate, making it sound ridiculous, childish. We all tried to explain that work isn't supposed to be about passion, it's supposed to be about building a future. But Daniel has never been able to separate dreams from reality. The way she said it, with such patient disappointment, made my choices sound like symptoms of a disorder rather than legitimate decisions about my own life. My father started pulling out specific examples, a greatest hits compilation of my failures as he saw them. The time I turned down a corporate job offer to backpack through Southeast Asia taking photographs. The time I quit a stable position to go back to school for a photography degree paying for another degree when he already had a perfectly good business degree, my father interjected. The time I chose to rent a small apartment downtown near my studio instead of moving back home to save money. Each story was presented as evidence of a pattern, proof that I was incapable of making sound decisions, that I needed their guidance now more than ever. Reality was being rewritten in front of others, and Tom sat there absorbing it all, probably congratulating himself on having married into the sensible side of the family. The thing is, my mother said, her voice heavy with maternal suffering, we've enabled this behavior. We've been too soft, too supportive of his whims. We paid for Collegia, a very expensive college, I might add, and what did he do with that education? Nothing. He's taking pictures at weddings and baby showers like he couldn't have done that without a degree. She turned to me then, her eyes glistening with what might have been genuine tears or might have been performance. Sweetheart, we love you. But love sometimes means tough truth. And the truth is, you're wasting your potential. You're wasting your life. And we can't just stand by and watch it happen anymore. The silence from the table reinforced control in ways that words never could. Nobody contradicted her, nobody offered an alternative perspective, nobody pointed out that maybe, just maybe, success looked different for different people. My father pulled out his phone and started showing Tom pictures, not my photographs, but photos of me from college, from my brief stint at the corporate job, dressed in suits and ties, looking professional. This is who Daniel could be, he said, swiping through images like he was presenting a lost version of me that everyone should mourn. Smart, presentable, on track. But instead, he shows up to family events in jeans and t-shirts smelling like darkroom chemicals, talking about his art like he's 22 instead of 32. The public humiliation was reaching new heights, and I could feel my face burning, could feel that old familiar shame trying to take hold. This was the family dinner humiliation I'd experienced in various forms my entire life, but never quite this orchestrated, never quite this brutal. Claire shared her own observations, painting a picture of me as someone perpetually on the verge of disaster. He's always one bad month away from not making rent. He doesn't have a retirement account. He drives a car that's 15 years old. He hasn't been on a real vacation in years because he can't afford it. And for what? So he can call himself an artist? So he can feel superior to those of us who made responsible choices? Her voice cracked on that last part, and I realized this wasn't really about me at all. This was about her own regrets, her own sacrificed dreams, projected onto me because my continued pursuit of passion was a mirror reflecting everything she'd given up. But she couldn't see that, or wouldn't, and so the assault continued. Tom, bless his completely tone-deaf heart, tried to be helpful. You know, Daniel, it's not too late to turn things around. You're only 32. You could still have a real career, build real wealth. In finance, we see people make career changes all the time. The key is recognizing when something isn't working and being willing to pivot. He said it so earnestly, so sincerely, as if I hadn't built a business from scratch, as if I didn't have clients who valued my work, as if the entire measure of a life was in salary figures and retirement accounts. The toxic family dynamics weren't just coming from my parents anymore. They'd recruited allies, built a coalition, created a unified front that made me feel like the crazy one for thinking I had a right to my own life. My mother brought out dessert, homemade apple pie with ice cream, and delivered the final blow with a smile. We're not trying to hurt you, sweetheart. We're trying to save you. And we've decided that the best way to help is to be honest, even if it's uncomfortable. Your father and I have talked, and we think it's time you faced some hard truths about where your choices are leading you. She cut the pie into perfect slices, her movements calm and practiced, while she systematically dismantled my sense of self. You owe us, Daniel. You owe us for the education we provided, for the opportunities we've created, for the years we've supported your dreams even when we knew they were unrealistic. And what we're asking in return is so simple: just consider this job opportunity. Just give reality a chance. Is that really too much to ask from the son we've sacrificed so much for? Something shifted in me between the pot roast and the apple pie, a quiet recalibration that felt like waking up from a dream I'd been having my entire life. I stopped trying to defend myself, stopped opening my mouth to correct their distortions, stopped feeling that desperate need to make them understand. Instead, I did something I'd never done before at one of these family dinners. I became completely still and just watched. Really watched. My therapist had been telling me for months that silent observation was a powerful tool, that stepping back and documenting what was actually happening could break the spell of emotional abuse in families. So I sat there, fork in hand, and I became a documentarian of my own life, cataloging every manipulative technique, every guilt trip, every carefully constructed lie. I listened, truly listened to the patterns in their speech, and it was like hearing a song I'd known all my life but never really understood the lyrics to until now. My father would make a statement framed as objective fact. My mother would add an emotional layer, usually involving her suffering or sacrifice. Claire would provide the sibling perspective that made their position seem balanced and reasonable. Tom would offer the outsider validation that suggested even people not invested in family drama could see I was wrong. It was choreography, a four-person dance they'd perfected over years, maybe decades. Every role was assigned. Every beat was timed. And I'd been so busy defending myself that I'd never stepped back far enough to see the pattern. I mentally documented everything, creating a catalog in my mind that would have made my therapist proud. There was the gaslighting, grading my history to make my choices seem like symptoms of instability rather than legitimate decisions. There was the triangulation assing Claire and Tom as validators, making me defend myself to an audience rather than just to my parents. There was the false equivalency, comparing my meaningful creative work to Tom's corporate job as if money was the only measure of worth. There was the emotional blackmail, you owe us, repeated in various forms throughout the dinner. And there was the constant moving of goalposts. 7 When I'd achieved success by any reasonable measure, it was never the right kind of success, never enough, never what they actually meant when they said they wanted me to be happy. My mother was telling a story about my high school graduation, how proud they'd been, how full of hope for my future. But I remembered that day differently. I remembered my father asking why I hadn't been valedictorian when I'd had the grades for it. I remembered my mother commenting that my speech was nice but not very ambitious. I remembered feeling like even my achievements were preludes to disappointment because they weren't quite what my parents had envisioned. But here, at this table, with Tom as the audience, the story was being rewritten as evidence of their unconditional support, their unwavering belief in me that I'd somehow betrayed. The family control was so complete, so totalizing, that they could rewrite reality in real time and everyone would nod along. I stayed calm, which was harder than it sounds when your entire sense of self is being systematically dismantled by the people who are supposed to love you most. Every instinct screamed at me to fight back, to correct the record, to make them see the truth. But I'd fought back before, hundreds of times over 3 decades, and it never worked. It only gave them ammunition, proof that I was defensive, immature, unable to handle constructive criticism. So instead, I took slow, deep breaths and watched my father's hands as he gestured, noting how he only pointed his finger when he was particularly pleased with a point he was making. I observed my mother's face, how her expression shifted depending on who she was addressing, wounded when looking at me, conspiratorial when glancing at Claire. The thing about controlling parents is they expect certain reactions. They've trained you over decades to respond in predictable ways, to argue, to justify, to apologize, to eventually cave and admit they might have a point. Your compliance feeds their sense of authority. Your emotional reactions prove you're not mature enough to make your own decisions. It's a system that perpetuates itself through your participation. But when you stop participating, when you go quiet and observant instead of defensive and reactive, something interesting happens. They don't quite know what to do with you. I watched confusion flicker across my mother's face when I didn't rise to her bait about my financial situation. I saw my father pause mid-sentence when I didn't interrupt to defend my business. Tom asked me a direct question: "Daniel, do you really think you can make a living doing this long-term?" And for a moment, everyone at the table went silent, waiting to see how I'd respond. My parents were ready to pounce on whatever I said, ready to twist it into further evidence of my delusion. Claire leaned forward slightly, probably expecting me to get defensive or angry. But I just looked at Tom, really looked at him, and said, "Yes." That was it. Just one word, no justification, no explanation, no defense. Just a simple statement of fact that needed no elaboration. The look on my father's face was almost comical. Had been preparing his rebuttal before I even spoke, had probably rehearsed it during whatever pre-dinner meeting they'd held, and now he had nothing to rebut. I observed how uncomfortable my simple confidence made everyone. In their narrative, I was supposed to be struggling, uncertain, slowly coming to the realization that they'd been right all along. My quiet certainty, undefended, unjustified certainty, didn't fit the story. So they tried to complicate it. My mother brought up health insurance again. My father mentioned retirement accounts for the third time. Claire started talking about the importance of homeownership. They were throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick, working so hard to maintain their version of reality. And I just sat there, eating my pie, sipping my coffee, and taking mental notes. Because somewhere between the appetizers and the dessert, I'd realized something crucial: I didn't need to win this argument. I just needed to stop participating in it. And as that realization settled into my bones, I felt something else settle there too: the beginning of a plan. While my mother poured coffee, the expensive kind she only served for special occasions, I made a decision that would change everything. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt of clarity, no movie moment where everything suddenly crystallized. It was quieter than that, more deliberate. I reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the outline of my phone, and I made a choice. Not to record them, not to document evidence for some future confrontation, but to anchor myself to something real, something true that existed outside this dining room and the distorted reality my family was trying to impose on me. The decision no one sees is always the most powerful one, I realized. While they were busy performing their intervention, I was writing my own script. Under the table, hidden from view, I pulled out my phone and opened my photo gallery. I scrolled to last week's wedding shoot, the Ramirez wedding, where the bride had cried when she saw her portraits, where the groom had shaken my hand and said I'd captured something he didn't even know existed until he saw it in the photographs. I looked at those images, at the joy and love and genuine human connection I'd managed to freeze in time, and I felt my resolve harden like concrete setting. These people at this dinner table didn't get to define my success. They didn't get to decide what my life meant or how it should be measured. I had created something beautiful, something meaningful, something that mattered to people who weren't them. Next, I opened my email and did something I'd been putting off for weeks. I replied to the message from Gallery 9, the downtown art gallery that had reached out about featuring my work in their upcoming exhibition on urban photography. I'd been hesitant, worried about what my parents would say, worried about whether I was ready for that kind of exposure. But sitting there, listening to my mother tell Tom about how I was wasting my potential, I typed out a simple response: "Yes, I'd love to participate. Please send me the details." I hit send and felt something shift in my chest, not relief exactly, but a kind of settling, a commitment to the path I'd chosen regardless of who approved or disapproved. The quiet choice I was making, sitting there with pie crumbs on my plate and judgment hanging in the air, was to stop seeking their approval entirely. It sounds simple, maybe even obvious, but for someone who'd spent 32 years desperately trying to be the son they wanted, it was seismic. I thought about all the opportunities I'd passed up because they didn't approve: the semester abroad in Italy studying Renaissance art, the assistant position with a renowned photographer in New York, the gallery showing 2 years ago that I'd declined because my father had called it premature. All the ways I'd contorted myself, compromised my vision, dimmed my own light trying to fit into their narrow definition of success. No more. The decision was made, silent and final, while my sister launched into another story about my supposed irresponsibility. I composed a text message to my studio partner, Lisa, who had been encouraging me to commit to the business full-time instead of hedging my bets. "Let's do it," I typed. "Full expansion. New equipment. Marketing budget. I'm all in." We'd been discussing growing the business for months, hiring an assistant, investing in better gear, expanding our services to include commercial photography. But I'd been holding back, some part of me still waiting for my parents' blessing, still hoping they'd eventually see what I was building and be proud. Sitting at that table, watching them systematically dismantle everything I'd worked for, I realized their blessing would never come. And more importantly, I realized I didn't need it. I sent the text and immediately felt lighter. Then I did something that surprised even me. I opened my banking app and looked at my account balance. It wasn't impressive by my father's standards, certainly nothing compared to what Tom probably made, but it was mine. I'd earned every dollar through my work, my vision, my hustle. And I had enough saved to cover 6 months of expenses, enough to weather slow periods, enough to invest in growth. I'd been taught to see this amount as embarrassing, as proof of failure, as evidence that I should give up and get a real job. But looking at it now, through eyes unclouded by their judgment, I saw something different. I saw independence. I saw freedom. I saw the financial foundation of a life I was building on my own terms. The silent power reversal was happening inside me, invisible to everyone at the table. I had one more prepared action, something I'd been considering for months but hadn't quite had the courage to execute. I opened my contacts and created a new group, emergency only, and added my parents' numbers to it. Then I went into my settings and customized the notification preferences, essentially creating a boundary that would allow me to check their messages when I chose to, rather than being constantly available for their criticisms and demands. It was a small thing, a technical adjustment that took less than a minute, but it represented something much larger: the reclamation of my time, my attention, my mental space. They would no longer have unrestricted access to me. The family pressure at dinner would not translate to daily phone calls dissecting my choices. Nobody at that table knew what was happening in my hands, hidden beneath the white tablecloth. They saw a quiet son, finally learning to listen, finally understanding his place. What they didn't see was a man making decisions, taking control, preparing for a shift they couldn't yet imagine. My mother offered me seconds on pie. I declined politely. My father started talking about the importance of legacy, about how our choices echo through generations. I nodded noncommittally. Claire mentioned that Tom's company was also hiring in their design department, as if design and photography were interchangeable, as if any creative field would satisfy my phase. And under the table, my phone held evidence of choices made, boundaries set, a future claimed. This was the beginning of my own family revenge stories, though revenge wasn't quite the right word. It was more like liberation, taking back the life they'd spent 3 decades trying to script for me. And the beautiful thing was, they had no idea it was happening. We moved to the living room for after-dinner drinks, and that's when I made my move. It wasn't planned in the traditional sense. I'd been preparing for something, but I didn't know exactly what until the moment presented itself. My father was pouring scotch, talking about how Richard Chen was expecting my call by Wednesday to set up the interview, when I set down my coffee cup with enough force to make it clink against the saucer. The sound cut through his monologue like a blade. "Dad," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I need to say something." He looked startled. I never interrupted him, never redirected conversations he was controlling. "Of course," he said, though his eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't part of the script, and he knew it. One action at the table, I thought. Sometimes that's all it takes to shift authority. "You've mentioned several times tonight that I owe you," I continued, maintaining eye contact in a way I'd never quite managed before. "For my education, for the opportunities you've created, for the years of support. I want to address that directly, because I think we need to be clear about what we're actually talking about." The room went dead silent. Claire's glass froze halfway to her lips. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, the beginning of anger. You chose to pay for my education. I didn't take out loans in your name or force you to write those tuition checks. You made that choice as parents. And if that choice came with conditions that were never discussed, that's not a debt I agreed to. The shift in authority was almost visible, like watching the air pressure change before a storm. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of witnesses, especially not by me. Daniel, that's no, you're twisting what I said, he managed finally, but his voice had lost its certainty. I'm not twisting anything, I replied, still calm, still measured. I'm clarifying. Because if paying for my education was an investment, then you should know the return on that investment is a son who's building a successful business doing work he loves. But if it was leverage, if it was a loan with interest paid in obedience, then we should discuss the terms of repayment so I can settle that debt and we can move forward. The family control they'd wielded so effortlessly all evening was slipping through their fingers like sand. My mother tried to salvage the situation with her usual tactics. Sweetheart, you're being dramatic. We're just concerned about you. Is it so wrong for parents to want their child to be secure? But I.D. spent the last hour observing her patterns, and I recognized this move: the pivot to victimhood, the reframing of control as concern. Mom, I said gently, you told Tom that I was wasting my life. You said my work was nothing, that I could do it without a degree. You rewrote my entire history to make it sound like I've been making poor decisions since childhood. That's not concern. That's something else, and I think we all know it. Tom looked down at his drink, clearly wishing he were anywhere else, but I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it for me. Here's what I know, I continued, and I could feel the power reversal completing itself with every word. I own a photography studio. I have steady clients. I was just invited to exhibit at Gallery 9. I pay my bills on time. I have savings. I have health insurance through the Freelancers Union. I'm building something real, something that matters to me and to the people I work with. Now, you can choose to celebrate that, or you can keep trying to convince me it's not enough. But either way, I'm done pretending your approval has any bearing on my life choices. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one was shocked, uncertain, the silence of people who'd just watched their carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. Claire, predictably, tried to smooth things over. Danny, come on, don't be like this. Mom and Dad are just trying to help. They've always, but I cut her off, something I'd never done before. Claire, with all respect, you don't get to tell me how to respond to having my life systematically dismissed for 2 hours. You sat there and agreed with everything they said. You compared my career to yours as if we're in competition. You suggested I don't understand what it means to be an adult. So forgive me if I don't really value your input on how I should be right now. She looked genuinely shocked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, and I realized that in all our years as siblings, ID never actually stood up to her. ID always deferred, always played the role of the younger brother who needed guidance. Not anymore. The family humiliation ID endured all evening was being returned, but not through cruelty, through truth. I pulled out my phone and showed them my calendar, my booking schedule for the next 3 months. See these? These are weddings, corporate events, portrait sessions. Each one represents people who value my work enough to pay me for it. Each one is a vote of confidence in my skills, my vision, my professionalism. I scrolled to my bank account, something I'd never have had the courage to do before, and showed them the balance. This is what wasting my life looks like. This is what throwing away my potential has earned me. It's not Tom's salary, it's not what you hoped I'd make, but it's mine. I earned it. And I'm proud of it. My father found his voice again, and it was harder than before, defensive. If you're so successful, Daniel, then why are you always so angry with us? Why can't you just accept that we want what's best for you? And there it was, the question that had haunted me my whole life, the accusation that my hurt feelings were the real problem, not their behavior. But I had an answer now, one I'd been working on in therapy for months. I'm not angry, Dad. I'm setting boundaries. And if you experience my boundaries as anger, that says more about your expectations than it does about my emotions. You owe us, you keep saying. But I think the question is, what do you owe me? Do you owe me respect for my choices? Do you owe me acceptance of who I actually am rather than who you wanted me to be? Because I've spent 32 years trying to earn your approval, and I just realized tonight it's not for sale. No amount of compliance will ever be enough. The shift happened in that moment. I watched it cross his face, the realization that he couldn't control me anymore, not with guilt, not with criticism, not with public pressure. The old power structure had reversed, and there was no going back. Tom and Claire left within 20 minutes, mumbling awkward excuses about babysitter schedules and early morning meetings. Claire hugged me stiffly on her way out, whispering, "You didn't have to do that," so quietly only I could hear, and I realized she wasn't upset on our parents' behalf. She was upset because I'd done what she had never had the courage to do. As their car pulled away, I watched my mother's composure crack like fine china dropped on tile. The abuser loses face when their performance is interrupted, when the curtain is pulled back and the audience sees what's really happening backstage. She'd worked so hard to orchestrate this perfect intervention, this demonstration of unified family concern, and I'd dismantled it with simple honesty. Her hands were shaking as she started clearing coffee cups with more force than necessary. "How dare you," my father said, his voice low and dangerous in a way I hadn't heard since I was a teenager. "How dare you embarrass us like that in front of Claire and Tom? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I stayed near the door, my jacket already on, keys in hand, ready to leave. "I told the truth, Dad. That's what I did. If the truth embarrasses you, maybe that's something you should think about." His face flushed red, the vein in his temple pulsing the way it did when he was truly angry. He looked like he wanted to yell, to assert his authority the way he had throughout my childhood, but something in my expression must have warned him that those tactics wouldn't work anymore. The family control they'd maintained for 3 decades was crumbling, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he felt it slipping away. My mother started crying, real tears that smeared her carefully applied makeup. "We've given you everything," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Everything a child could want. The best schools, the best opportunities, unconditional love and support. And this is how you repay us? By humiliating us? By throwing our care back in our faces?" I felt that old, familiar guilt trying to take hold, that programming that said good sons don't make their mothers cry. But I'd learned to recognize it now, to see it for what it was: manipulation, not genuine emotion. "Mom, you don't love me unconditionally. You love the version of me that does what you want. There's a difference." My voice was gentle but firm, and somehow that seemed to hurt her more than if I'd yelled. The fallout was spreading in real time. My phone buzzed, a text from Claire. "Dad's talking about cutting you out of the will. Says he wants support, someone who has no respect for family." I stared at the message, waiting for the panic to hit, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt something close to relief. Let them cut me out. I'd been financially independent for years anyway. The only thing they could really withdraw was their conditional approval, and I'd just publicly declared that I didn't need it anymore. I texted back, "That's his choice to make. I hope it brings him peace." Claire responded immediately, "You're really going to throw away your family over this? Over your pride?" As if I was the one doing the throwing, as if I was the one who'd made love conditional on absolute compliance. My father found his voice again, cold and controlled in that way that was somehow worse than yelling. "If this is how you're going to be, Daniel, then maybe you should leave. Clearly, you don't value what we've tried to build here. Clearly, our concern is just an inconvenience to you." He was trying to hurt me, trying to use rejection as a weapon the way he always had. But I'd been preparing for this, building up immunity to this exact poison. I think leaving is a good idea, I agreed, heading for the door. But just so we're clear, I do value what you've done for me. I'm grateful for my childhood, for the education, for the stability you provided. What I don't value is being treated like a project that failed, like an investment that didn't pay off the way you expected. There's a difference. The change others noticed wasn't just in might, was in the whole family system. Without me playing my role as the problem child, the disappointment, the one who needed fixing, the entire dynamic had to shift. I could see it in their faces, the confusion and anger of people whose familiar patterns had been disrupted. My mother stopped crying and just looked at me, really looked at me, and for a second I thought maybe she'd understand, maybe this would be the moment something shifted in her too. But then she said, "You'll regret this. When you're struggling and alone, when your little photography hobby fails and you have nothing to fall back on, you'll realize we were right. And we might not be here to help you pick up the pieces." It was meant to scare me, to make me reconsider, but all it did was confirm that nothing had changed for her. My father walked to his office and returned with a checkbook, an actual checkbook, like we were living in 1985. "Fine," he said, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. "If you want to settle debts, let's settle debts. For years of tuition at Cornell, plus room and board, plus the car we bought you junior year, plus the money we gave you for deposits when you moved to the city. I'll calculate it all up, send you an invoice. Then we'll be even, and you can stop throwing our generosity in our faces." The emotional revenge he was attempting was almost comical in its transparency. He thought putting a dollar amount on parenting would hurt me, would make me realize how much I owed. But all it did was reveal how transactional their love had always been. I walked to the door, my hand on the knob, and turned back one last time. "You can send me whatever invoice you want, Dad. I'll even pay it if that's what you need to feel better about this. But just know no amount of money will change what happened here tonight. You tried to control me by humiliating me in front of witnesses, and it didn't work. You tried to guilt me into giving up my life for yours, and it didn't work. You tried to rewrite my reality, and I refused to let you. That's what actually happened tonight." Behind me, I could hear my mother's quiet sobs, my father's heavy breathing, the sound of a family system collapsing under the weight of its own toxicity. I walked out into the cool night air, and this time, I didn't look back. My phone buzzed again, Lisa responding to my earlier text about expanding the business. "Yes. I knew you'd come around. Let's change everything." I smiled, got in my 15-year-old car that ran perfectly fine, and drove toward a future I was finally ready to claim. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, just breathing and letting the adrenaline work its way through my system. The street was quiet, lined with houses identical to my parents' manicured lawns, attached garages, porch lights glowing warm against the darkness. Perfect suburban facades hiding who knows what kind of family drama behind closed doors. My hands were shaking slightly, my heart still racing, but underneath the physical reaction was something I'd never quite felt before: certainty. Silence was strategy, I realized. All those years I'd thought staying quiet meant I was weak, that I was letting them win. But tonight I'd learned that silence could be observation, preparation, power gathering in the shadows before the strike. I hadn't stayed silent to hide, I'd stayed silent to see clearly. The final lesson crystallized as I drove home through empty streets: control fails when witnesses see the truth. My parents had wielded their authority for so long because nobody ever questioned the narrative they presented. They were concerned parents, I was a directionless son, end of story. But when I'd spoken up in front of Claire and Tom, when I'd named what was actually happening, the manipulation, the rewriting of history, the conditional love disguised as concern, the spell broke. It didn't matter that my parents doubled down, that Claire defended them, that my mother cried. What mattered was that for the first time, their version of reality had been publicly challenged, and the challenge had landed. Tom's uncomfortable silence, Claire's quick exit, the way neither of them quite met my parents' eyes as they left, all of it was evidence that at least some witnesses had seen through the performance. I thought about all the family revenge stories I'd read online, the tales of people going no contact or sending scorched earth emails or posting their grievances on social media. I'd always felt uncomfortable with those stories, like they were too dramatic, too final, too much. But I understood them now in a way I never had before. They weren't about revenge at all, they were about reclamation. Every person who'd ever stood up to toxic family dynamics was just trying to take back the parts of themselves that had been slowly eroded by years of guilt at dinner, years of being told their reality was wrong, their choices were mistakes, their very existence was a disappointment. The dramatic confrontations weren't the point, they were just the visible moment when invisible damage finally became too much to carry silently. My phone rang. Lisa, who I'd texted during dinner. I answered on speaker as I drove. "Tell me you're serious about going all in," she demanded, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. "Because I've been waiting for you to commit for months, and I swear if this is just another false start, I'm going to kill you." I laughed, a real laugh that felt foreign after the tension of the evening. "I'm serious. Dead serious. Let's expand the studio, upgrade equipment, launch that commercial division we've been talking about. I'm done hedging my bets. I'm done waiting for permission that's never going to come." She whooped so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Finally. "God, Daniel, do you have any idea how talented you are? How long I've been watching you dim your own light because of those people." The silent power reversal I'd engineered wasn't really about power at all, it was about autonomy. I didn't need to control my parents or punish them or make them see things my way. I just needed them to stop controlling me, and the only way to make that happen was to stop giving them the authority to do so. No more seeking their approval. No more justifying my choices. No more accepting their version of my reality as more valid than my own lived experience. The shift hadn't happened in the confrontation itself, that was just the visible symptom. The real shift had happened during those quiet moments of observation, when I'd stopped defending and started documenting, stopped reacting and started choosing. When I'd made those silent decisions under the table, sending emails and texts that staked my claim on my own future. I got home to my small apartment, the one my parents had called beneath me, the one they'd said I'd outgrow once I got serious about life, and I looked around with new eyes. The exposed brick walls covered in my photographs. The vintage camera collection on the bookshelf. The darkroom I'd built in the second bedroom. The desk where I edited photos late into the night, losing myself in the work I loved. This wasn't a stepping stone to something better. This was it. This was my life, the one I'd chosen, the one I'd built despite constant pressure to build something else. And it was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what I wanted. The truth about controlling parents is that they genuinely believe they're helping. They've convinced themselves that their criticism is wisdom, their manipulation is guidance, their emotional abuse is love. My parents weren't villains in some family revenge stories, they were damaged people perpetuating damage they'd probably received from their own parents. Understanding that didn't mean I had to accept their behavior, but it helped me let go of the fantasy that someday they'd wake up and apologize, that eventually they'd realize what they'd done and change. They probably wouldn't. They'd probably die believing they were right and I was ungrateful. And I had to be okay with that, had to choose my own peace over their approval, my own reality over their revision. That night, lying in my own bed in my own apartment that I paid for with money I earned doing work I loved, I thought about what my mother had said as I was leaving: "You'll regret this when you're alone and struggling." But I wasn't alone. I had Lisa, I had my clients, I had friends who valued me for who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be. And I wasn't struggling, I was building something real, something meaningful, something that was entirely mine. The family dinner humiliation that was supposed to break me had instead freed me. The intervention designed to bring me back in line had pushed me toward the independence I'd been too afraid to fully claim. And that, I realized as sleep finally came, was the greatest reversal of all. They'd tried to use witnesses to reinforce their control, and instead those witnesses had seen the truth, not the truth they'd wanted them to see, but the truth that would set me free. Control fails when the controlled stop playing their assigned role. And I was done playing. Finally, completely, irreversibly done. 4 months have passed since that dinner, and my life looks fundamentally different now, not because everything changed overnight, but because I changed what I was willing to tolerate. My parents and I haven't spoken since that night. My father did send an invoice, believe it or not, a detailed spreadsheet calculating every dollar they'd spent on me from birth through college, complete with interest calculations. I didn't pay it, not because I couldn't, but because paying it would validate the premise that love is transactional, that parenting is an investment expecting returns. Claire calls occasionally, usually after she's had wine, asking when I'm going to apologize and fix this mess. The family drama continues without me. I'm sure they've probably crafted new narratives to explain my absence, new ways to position themselves as the wounded parties. And honestly, I sleep better than I have in years. What I've learned in these 4 months is that freedom has a price, but it's nothing compared to the cost of staying imprisoned. Sometimes freedom feels lonely. There are moments when I want to call my mother about something mundane, before I remember we don't have that kind of relationship, maybe never did. Sometimes it feels scary, like I'm walking without a safety net I didn't realize was actually a cage. But underneath the loneliness and fear and grief for what never was, there's something solid and unshakable peace. The peace of living authentically. The peace of making choices aligned with my values rather than someone else's expectations. The peace of no longer carrying a debt that was never mine to pay. And that peace is worth everything I lost to gain it. The silent power reversal that began at that public family dinner didn't end when I walked out the door. It continues every day, in ways both small and profound. It's in the decisions I make without seeking approval first. It's in the boundaries I maintain without apologizing for them. It's in the way I've stopped justifying my existence to people who were never going to validate it anyway. My photography business has doubled since that night, not because I suddenly got better at my craft, but because I stopped hedging, stopped holding back, stopped waiting for permission to be fully myself. Gallery 9 exhibition was a success. Commercial clients started calling. And every single achievement feels different now, because it's mine, earned on my terms, celebrated by people who actually see me. So hey Race, what I want to ask you, because if you've read this far, something in this story has struck a chord. What debt are you carrying that you never agreed to? Where in your life are you performing gratitude for something that should have been given freely? What version of yourself are you sacrificing to keep other people comfortable? And hey Race, the harder question, what would happen if you stopped? Not with anger or drama or revenge, but simply with calm clarity and firm boundaries. What would happen if you asked, like I finally did, what exactly do I owe you, and did I ever consent to these terms? Think about the guilt at dinner in your own life, maybe not literal dinner tables, maybe just the moments when you feel that familiar weight of obligation pressing down on you, when love feels less like a gift and more like a contract with fine print you never read. What would it look like to renegotiate those terms? What would it feel like to say no without elaborate justification, to choose your own path even when it disappoints people who claim to know better? I'm not saying it's easy, God knows it wasn't easy for me. But I am saying it's possible, and I'm saying you deserve it. You deserve to live without carrying someone else's expectations on your back like a cross you're supposed to be grateful for. The toxic family dynamics I described aren't unique to my family, they exist in countless variations across millions of households. Maybe your version involves a spouse who keeps score of every favor. Maybe it's friends who remind you of everything they've done for you whenever you try to set a boundary. Maybe it's a workplace that demands loyalty while offering none in return. The specifics vary, but the pattern is the same. Someone benefits from your sense of obligation, from your compliance, from your willingness to pay a debt that keeps growing no matter how much you sacrifice. And the only way to break that pattern is to stop accepting the premise that the debt is real. I won't lie to you and say that standing up for yourself comes without cost. I lost my relationship with my parents, at least for now, maybe forever. I lost the fantasy of the family I wished I had. I lost the comfort of familiar patterns, even when those patterns were slowly killing who I actually was. But what I gained, me self-respect, my autonomy, my right to define success on my own terms, was worth infinitely more than what I lost. Every day that passes, I become more certain of that trade. Every choice I make from a place of authenticity rather than obligation, every boundary I maintain without apology, reinforces that I made the right decision. Not the easy decision, but the right one. So what about you? Are you ready to stop paying for a life you never asked to finance? Are you ready to question the debts you've been told you owe, to examine whether the contract you're living under is one you ever actually signed? It won't be comfortable. People who benefit from your compliance will call you selfish, ungrateful, cruel. They'll remind you of everything they've done for you, every sacrifice they've made, every dollar they've spent. But here's the secret: they don't want you to know if their love requires payment. It was never love in the first place. That dinner where my mother said you owe us and I put the truth on the table, that was just the beginning of my story of reclamation. What will be the beginning of yours? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you feel less alone in your own struggles with family control and emotional abuse in families, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing your experience, even if it's just "I needed this today." It helps me know this content matters, that these stories need to be told. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and smash that notification bell. I share stories like this regularly, raw, honest accounts of breaking free from toxic patterns and building lives that actually fit who we are, not who we were told to be. You deserve to be part of a community that gets it, that won't judge you for choosing yourself over obligation. So join us. Your future self, the one who's finally free, will thank you for it. The debt you think you owe, it's not real. And you don't need anyone's permission to stop paying it. Not even mine. Especially not theirs.